So we'd like to begin. So the first round, again, the motion for debate is Florida state law may be flawed, but stand your ground is a fundamentally sound policy that protects the innocent. First up to argue in favor of this motion, we have Mr. Andrew Branca. Thank you.
Before I start on the timer, I just want to say normally I spend 4.5 hours covering this material. They gave me 6 minutes. So if I talk quickly, you'll understand why. And I'll set a little clock for myself. Okay, stand your ground. What is it? Perhaps as important, what isn't it? Because there's a lot of confusion about it, and why is it important? To understand stand your ground, you first have to understand what we mean by a legal claim of self-defense. When you make a legal claim of self-defense, there's 5 elements that have to be met. Innocence, you have to have not been the aggressor in the fight. Imminence, you have to be facing a threat of death or grave bodily harm that's about to happen right now. Proportionality, the amount of force you use in self-defense has to be no greater than necessary. Reasonableness, your conduct has to be both subjectively and objectively reasonable. And the 5th element, avoidance, if you have a safe path of retreat, you have a legal duty to take advantage of that before you use deadly force in self-defense. That's the crux of stand your ground. Now, having said that, 34 states do not impose a duty to retreat. They excuse that 5th element. It's 34 states. 16 states do impose that duty to retreat. So the 34 are essentially stand your ground states. There's no duty to retreat. 16 states, that minority of states, impose that duty to retreat. It's also important to recognize that that's all stand your ground does, is excuse that 5th element, that element of the legal duty to retreat. Those 4 other elements are not touched. So if you're in a stand your ground state and you claim self-defense, you still have to be able to present evidence that you were wholly innocent, wholly without fault in starting the fight, that you were facing an imminent threat of death that was going to happen right now, that you used no more force than necessary, and that your conduct was both objectively and subjectively reasonable. If you fail on any one of those elements, your claim of self-defense fails. So it's important to understand that stand your ground is not some kind of weird parallel or alternative way of arguing self-defense. There's no such thing as a legal claim of stand your ground instead of a legal claim of self-defense. If you're in a stand your ground state and you argue self-defense, you're arguing self-defense just as you would in a duty to retreat state. The only difference is you only have those first 4 elements and not the 5th one. That's the only difference between the 2 states. Knowing that, we also know what stand your ground does not do. So, does stand your ground give you a right to kill someone out of an act of aggression? No, you still have to be without fault in starting the fight. Does stand your ground allow you to kill someone on the basis of a speculative fear of harm, something that might happen? No, you still have to be facing an imminent threat of death or grave bodily harm. Does stand your ground allow you to kill someone if they're only threatening you with non-deadly force? No, your force has to be proportional to the threat with which you're being threatened. And does stand your ground allow you to kill on the basis of an irrational fear? Say someone has a racist fear of young black men. Would that justify, understand your ground, their right to kill somebody? Absolutely not. Because your ability to defend yourself under the law, even in a stand your ground state, requires that your conduct be both subjectively and objectively reasonable. So why is stand your ground important? Well, in the 16 duty to retreat states, they're not satisfied if you meet only those first 4 elements of self-defense. So even if you were wholly without fault in starting the fight, you were simply attacked by a criminal predator, even if you were facing an imminent threat of death right now, even if you used no more force than necessary, and even if your conduct was both subjectively and objectively reasonable, even with all that stipulated, they reserve the right to put you in jail for the rest of your life if you don't jump through one last hoop. And what they want you to do is prove a negative. They want you to prove that there did not exist a safe avenue of retreat. You know, I've heard it said that folks who support stand your ground, and I do support stand your ground, are somehow celebrating death. Well, it's quite the opposite. we celebrate life. I love life. I love my life, my children's life, my wife's, my parents, my siblings, my friends, my colleagues. I love the life of everyone here in this room. I want us all to live. In a perfect world, no one would die a violent death. But in the real world, murderers and rapists and violent assaulters exist. And their victims number in the hundreds of thousands every year. They're real, and the consequences of their violence is real. All Stand Your Ground says is that if you or your loved one or your friend, through no fault of your own, is the victim of a violent attack, and that attack represents an imminent threat of death or grave bodily harm about to happen right now, and you use no more force than necessary to defend yourself, and your conduct was both subjectively and objectively reasonable, that's enough. That's enough for you to be allowed to lawfully defend yourself. The consequence, of course, of, say, repealing Stand Your Ground is pretty dire. What that means is even if all those circumstances are met, you were wholly without fault, the threat of death was imminent, you used no more force than necessary, your conduct was reasonable, but you are unable to prove there was no safe avenue of retreat, they reserve the right to put you in jail for the rest of your life. That's what not having Stand Your Ground means. And that's why I support Stand Your Ground. Thank you. I had 1 second left. That's pretty good.
Thank you, Mr. Branca.